in the unforgiving wilderness of 1870s Arizona, where trust between settlers and Apache warriors was as rare as water in the desert. One woman's simple act of mercy would forever change the fate of her family and challenge everything both sides believed about their enemies. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of southeastern Arizona as Martha Henderson stepped onto the wooden porch of her modest homestead. The year was 1874, and the territory was still a dangerous frontier where survival depended more on luck and wit than on law and order. Her calloused hands gripped the worn handle of a water bucket, and her weathered face showed the strain of 3 years spent carving out a life from this harsh land. Martha was not your typical frontier woman. At 32, she had already buried one husband back in Missouri and raised 2 children largely on her own. When the opportunity came to claim land in Arizona territory, she saw it as a chance for a fresh start. Her neighbors thought she was foolish, a widow woman trying to work a farm with only her teenage son Samuel and 12-year-old daughter Emma to help her. But Martha had something that many lacked, an iron will and a heart that refused to see suffering without trying to help. The Henderson farm sat on a small rise overlooking a creek that ran year-round, making it one of the more desirable pieces of land in the area. Their nearest neighbors, the Crawfords, lived nearly 5 miles to the east, and the small town of Wilcox was a full day's ride south. It was isolated, which suited Martha fine, but it also meant that trouble could come calling without warning. On this particular morning, Martha noticed something unusual as she made her way to the well. The chickens in their coop were unusually quiet, and their old dog Rex was packing nervously near the barn, his ears pricked forward and his hackles slightly raised. She paused, scanning the landscape with eyes that had learned to read danger in every shadow and movement. The Apache raids had been increasing in frequency over the past months. The military at nearby Fort Bowie did their best to patrol the area, but the vast territory made it impossible to protect every isolated homestead. Martha had heard the stories from other settlers: crops burned, livestock stolen, sometimes worse. She kept a loaded rifle by the door and had taught both her children to shoot, but she harbored no illusions about their chances if a war party decided to target their farm. As she drew water from the well, a movement in the mesquite grove caught her eye. At first, she thought it might be a deer or perhaps a stray cow from the Crawford place, but something about the way the brush moved seemed wrong, too deliberate, too careful. Martha set down the bucket and walked quietly back toward the house, her hand instinctively moving toward the rifle that leaned against the porch railing. Samuel emerged from the barn where he had been milking their 2 cows. At 17, he had grown tall and strong from the hard work of frontier life, but his face still held the soft features of youth. He saw his mother's tense posture and immediately became alert. "Ma, what is it?" "Not sure yet," Martha whispered, never taking her eyes off the grove. "Get Emma and keep her inside, quietly." Samuel nodded and disappeared into the house. Martha heard him speaking in low tones to his sister, and within moments both children appeared at the window, their faces pressed against the glass. Martha wished she could send them somewhere safer, but there was nowhere to go. The nearest fort was 20 miles away, and their horse was not fast enough to outrun Apache ponies if trouble was coming. Minutes passed like hours as Martha watched and waited. The desert wind picked up, rustling the sage brush and making it even harder to distinguish between natural movement and potential threat. Just as she was beginning to think her nerves were getting the better of her, a figure stumbled out of the mesquite grove. Martha's breath caught in her throat. It was a man, but unlike any she had seen before in these parts. His skin was bronze, and his long black hair was matted and unkempt. He wore traditional Apache clothing, a breechcloth, high moccasins, and a shirt that might once have been white but was now stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. But what struck Martha most was his condition. The man was clearly starving. His ribs showed through tears in his shirt, his cheeks were hollow, and he moved with the unsteady gait of someone who had not eaten in days. The Apache warrior, for Martha had no doubt that's what he was, stumbled and fell to his knees about 50 yards from the house. He tried to rise but collapsed again, his head hanging in exhaustion. Martha's mind raced. Every instinct told her to grab the rifle and defend her family. The Apache were feared throughout the territory, and with good reason. They were skilled fighters who knew the land better than any white man ever would. They had been fighting for their survival against an endless stream of settlers, soldiers, and miners who wanted their ancestral lands. But as Martha watched the man struggle just to remain conscious, something else stirred within her. She had seen that look before during the hard winter when Samuel was small and her first husband had died. She remembered the hollow eyes and the way hunger could drain all the fight out of a person. This man was not a threat. He was dying. "Ma, don't," Samuel called softly from the window. He had grabbed his father's old pistol and was watching the scene with fear and determination. It could be a trick. Martha knew her son was probably right. Apache warriors were known for their cunning in warfare, but something about this man's condition seemed too genuine to fake. No warrior would allow himself to become so weakened unless he truly had no choice. The man on the ground lifted his head with great effort and looked directly at Martha. Their eyes met across the dusty yard, and she saw something that surprised her. There was no hostility in his gaze, no calculation or threat. There was only desperation and a dignity that somehow remained intact despite his pitiful state. Martha made a decision that would change all their lives forever. She walked slowly down from the porch, her hands empty and visible. The Apache warrior watched her approach but made no move to rise or reach for any weapons. As she drew closer, Martha could see that he was even younger than she had first thought, probably not much older than Samuel. His face, beneath the grime and exhaustion, was intelligent and proud. When she was about 10 feet away, Martha stopped. She did not know if he understood English, but she spoke anyway, keeping her voice calm and gentle. "You're hurt and hungry," she said. "I can help you." The young warrior's eyes widened slightly. He had obviously understood at least some of what she said. He tried to speak, but only managed a whisper that was lost in the wind. Martha took another step forward, and this time he did not tense or pull away. Behind her, she could hear Samuel hissing her name from the window, but she ignored him. She knelt down in the dirt beside the Apache warrior and got her first close look at his condition. In addition to severe malnutrition, he had what appeared to be an infected wound on his left shoulder. The flesh around it was red and swollen, and Martha could smell the sickly, sweet odor of infection. "Can you walk?" she asked. When he did not respond, she made a gesture toward the house and then looked at him questioningly. The warrior nodded weakly and, with Martha's help, managed to get to his feet. Together, they made their slow way toward the house, Martha supporting most of his weight. She could feel how light he was, as if his bones were hollow like a bird's. Samuel met them at the door, his pistol still in his hand but lowered. His face was pale with fear and confusion. "Ma, what are you doing? The neighbors will think we've lost our minds." "The neighbors aren't here," Martha replied firmly. "Emma, bring me clean cloths and hot water. Samuel, help me get him to the kitchen." Emma, who had been watching from the doorway, hesitated for a moment. At 12, she was old enough to understand the implications of what her mother was doing. But she was also her mother's daughter, and compassion ran deep in the Henderson family. She nodded and ran to gather the supplies. They settled the Apache warrior in a chair at the kitchen table. Up close, Martha could see that he was indeed very young, perhaps 19 or 20. His eyes, though dulled by hunger and fever, held an intelligence that impressed her. She could also see that he was fighting to maintain consciousness, his pride warring with his body's desperate need for rest and nourishment. Martha went to work with the efficiency of someone who had tended many injuries over the years. She carefully cleaned the infected wound on his shoulder, noting that it appeared to be from a bullet. The warrior endured her ministrations without a sound, though she could see the pain in his eyes. When she applied a poultice made from herbs she kept for such purposes, he finally allowed himself a small grunt of relief. "Emma, bring me some of that broth from yesterday's chicken," Martha instructed. "And Samuel, stop pointing that gun at him. He can barely sit up, let alone fight." Samuel reluctantly set the pistol aside, but remained tense and ready to grab it again at a moment's notice. Emma returned with a bowl of warm broth, and Martha carefully spooned small amounts into the warrior's mouth. At first, he could only manage a few sips before his stomach rebelled, but gradually he was able to take more. As the afternoon wore on, the Apache warrior began to show signs of recovery. His eyes grew clearer, and some color returned to his face. Martha continued to tend his wound and feed him small amounts of food and water. Neither of them spoke much, she because she was unsure of the language barrier, and he because he was clearly struggling to process this unexpected kindness from people he had probably been taught to see as enemies. The sun was beginning to set when the warrior finally spoke, his voice hoarse but clear. "Why?" he asked in English that was accented but perfectly understandable. Martha looked up from where she was preparing a fresh bandage for his shoulder. It was a fair question, and one she had been asking herself all day. "Because you needed help," she said simply. The warrior studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether she was telling the truth. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I am called Nalnish," he said. "In your language, it means he works hard. I'm Martha Henderson. These are my children, Samuel and Emma." Nalnish nodded to each of them in turn. Samuel managed a stiff nod in return, while Emma offered a shy smile. "My people," Nalnish continued carefully, "they think all white eyes are the same. They think you are all enemies who want only to take and destroy." Martha finished rapping his shoulder and sat back. "And what do you think?" "Today, I think my people are not always right." It was a simple statement, but Martha understood the enormous significance of it. For an Apache warrior to question his people's beliefs about whites was tantamount to questioning everything he had been raised to believe. As darkness fell, Martha faced another difficult decision. The safe thing would be to give Nalnish some food and send him on his way. But she could see that he was still far from fully recovered, and the infection in his shoulder needed more time to heal. Sending him out into the desert night could very well be a death sentence. "You can stay the night," she said finally, "but I want your word that you mean no harm to my family." Nalnish looked at her with surprise. "You would trust the word of an Apache." "I would trust the word of the man I helped today." The warrior was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was filled with something that might have been wonder. "You have my word, Martha Henderson. No harm will come to your family from me." Samuel started to protest, but Martha silenced him with a look. She prepared a bed for Nalnish on the floor of the kitchen, close enough to the stove to keep him warm but far enough from the bedrooms to give her children some sense of security. As the family prepared for what would surely be a restless night, Martha found herself wondering what the morning would bring. She had crossed a line that few settlers ever dared to cross, showing mercy to one of the very people that her neighbors feared most. Whether that mercy would be rewarded or whether it would bring disaster down upon her family remained to be seen. But as she looked at Nalnish, now resting peacefully by the warmth of the stove, Martha felt no regret for her decision. In a land where hatred and fear ruled the relationship between Apache and settler, she had chosen to see the humanity in her enemy. It was a choice that would soon have consequences none of them could have imagined. Outside, the desert night was full of its usual sounds: the howl of coyotes, the rustle of small animals in the brush, and the whisper of wind through the mesquite. But tonight, there seemed to be something else in the air, a sense of change coming like a storm on the horizon. Martha lay in her bed, listening to the familiar sounds of her children's breathing and the occasional movement from the kitchen where their unexpected guest rested. She had made many difficult decisions since coming to this harsh land, but none had felt as momentous as the one she had made today. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she was certain. The question was whether her act of mercy would lead to tragedy or to something entirely unexpected in this land where enemies rarely became anything else. Martha woke before dawn, as was her habit, but this morning felt different from all the others since she had arrived in Arizona territory. The events of the previous day seemed almost like a dream until she heard the soft sound of movement from the kitchen. Her Apache guest was awake. She dressed quietly and made her way downstairs, finding Nalnish sitting at the kitchen table, his dark eyes alert despite the early hour. His color was much better than it had been the day before, and when he moved to stand as she entered, Martha could see that his strength was returning. "Please don't get up," she said softly, mindful of her sleeping children upstairs. "How do you feel this morning?" "Much stronger, thanks to your kindness," Nalnish replied. His English was better than she had initially realized, probably learned from traders or perhaps missionaries. "The fever has broken and the pain in my shoulder is less." Martha checked his wound and was pleased to see that the angry redness had diminished significantly. The poultice had done its work, and proper rest and nourishment were clearly helping his body heal. "You've had medical training," Nalnish observed as she rewrapped his shoulder with fresh cloth. "Nothing formal," Martha replied. "But when you're raising children on the frontier, you learn to tend injuries and illnesses out of necessity. My grandmother back in Missouri was known for her healing skills. She taught me what she could before I married and moved west." As she worked, Martha found herself stealing glances at the young man's face. In the morning light, with some of his strength restored, She could see the intelligence and dignity that marked him as someone of importance among his people. His bearing suggested he was not just any warrior, but perhaps someone with significant standing in his tribe. "May I ask," Martha said carefully, "how you came to be in such a condition when I found you, if you don't mind sharing, that is." Nalnish was quiet for several moments, and Martha wondered if she had overstepped some boundary. But finally he began to speak, his voice low and measured. "3 weeks ago, I was with a hunting party in the Dragoon Mountains. We were not raiding, just seeking deer and elk to feed our families. The reservation food is not enough, and many of our children were hungry." He paused, and Martha could see the pain in his eyes. "We were attacked by a group of white men, not soldiers but civilians. They had been tracking us for days." Martha's heart sank. She had heard stories of vigilante groups that took it upon themselves to hunt down Apache bands, often without regard for whether they were hostile or peaceful. "They killed 4 of my companions," Nalnish continued. "I was shot in the shoulder but managed to escape into a deep canyon. I hid there for 2 days, but when I tried to return to my people, I found that soldiers had moved them again. The reservation where my family was supposed to be was empty." "So you've been searching for them ever since," Martha said, understanding dawning. Nalnish nodded. "For 15 days I have traveled across this desert, eating whatever I could find, drinking from any water source I could reach. Yesterday morning I was close to death when I saw the smoke from your cooking fire." Martha felt a deep sadness for this young man's plight. The constant moving of Apache bands from one reservation to another was a source of confusion and heartbreak for families who often had no way to find each other once separated. "Your family," she asked gently, "do you have a wife, children?" "A wife, yes, Iana. Her name means eternal blossom. We have been married for 2 years, and a son born just before the last move to the reservation. He would be walking now, maybe saying his first words." Nalnish's voice grew thick with emotion. "I do not even know if they are alive." The pain in his voice touched something deep in Martha's heart. She understood the agony of separation from those you loved, the fear that consumed you when you did not know their fate. When her first husband had died, she had felt lost and alone, but she had at least known what had happened to him. Nalnish lived with uncertainty that was probably far worse than grief. "We will help you find them," Martha said impulsively. The words surprised her even as they left her mouth, but once spoken, she knew she meant them. Nalnish stared at her in amazement. "You would do that for an Apache?" "I would do that for any father trying to find his family." Before Nalnish could respond, they heard footsteps on the stairs. Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway, fully dressed and clearly having been awake long enough to hear at least part of their conversation. His expression was troubled. "Ma, you can't be serious about helping him search for more Apache. What if we lead him to a war party? What if this is all some elaborate trick?" Martha understood her son's concerns, but she also saw the desperate hope that had appeared in Nalnish's eyes at her offer. "Samuel, sometimes we have to choose between fear and compassion. I choose compassion." "And what if that choice gets us all killed?" It was a fair question, and one that Martha had been wrestling with since the moment she decided to help the starving warrior. She looked at both young men, her son and the Apache warrior who could have been her son, and made a decision that came from deep in her heart. "Nalnish," she said, "I want you to tell me about your people. Not the stories I've heard from other settlers, but the truth about who you are and what you believe in." Nalnish glanced at Samuel, who was still watching him with suspicion, then back to Martha. "What would you like to know?" "Everything. Start with your family, your life before all this trouble began." As Emma joined them in the kitchen, drawn by the sound of voices, Nalnish began to tell his story. He spoke of growing up in the Chiricahua Mountains, learning to hunt and track from his father and grandfather. He described the Apache way of life, the close-knit family groups, the respect for the land and all living things, the complex social structure that governed their society. "We are not the savages your people believe us to be," he said quietly. "We have laws, traditions, ceremonies. We take care of our elderly and teach our children to be honorable. We value courage, yes, but also wisdom and loyalty to family." As he spoke, Martha noticed that even Samuel seemed to be listening with growing interest. This was not the bloodthirsty savage of frontier legend, but a young man who clearly loved his family and his way of life. "Then why the raids?" Samuel asked, his voice still wary but no longer hostile. "Why the attacks on settlers? Nalnish was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Your people have taken our land, forced us onto reservations where we cannot live as we always have. They have broken treaties and moved us again and again, always to worse places. Many of our leaders have tried to make peace, but your government does not keep its promises. He looked directly at Samuel. What would you do if strangers came and took your home, scattered your family, and told you that you must live in a place where you could not provide for those you love? It was a question that Samuel had no easy answer for, and Martha could see him struggling with concepts he had never really considered before. Emma, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. Where do you think your wife and baby are now? I believe they may have been taken to the San Carlos reservation, Nalnish replied. But it is far from here, and the journey would be dangerous for me alone. The soldiers would shoot me on sight if they saw me traveling there. Martha made her decision. Then we'll take you there. Ma, Samuel protested. That's days of travel through Apache country, and when we get there, what then? We can't just walk onto a reservation and start asking for one particular Apache family. Martha looked at her son with the patience of a mother who understood his fears, but had made up her mind. Samuel, we have a wagon and supplies. We can say we're bringing goods to trade at the agency store. It's not uncommon for settlers to do business with the reservation. And if we can reunite this young man with his family, we'll have done something good in a world that has too little goodness in it. As the morning progressed, Martha began making preparations for what would be a journey of at least 5 days through some of the most dangerous territory in Arizona. She sent Samuel to check on their neighbors, the Crawfords, to let them know the family would be away for a week or so. She did not mention their traveling companion, knowing that such information would spread quickly and possibly bring unwanted attention from vigilante groups or the military. While Samuel was gone, Martha and Emma worked with Nalnish to plan their route. His knowledge of the country was invaluable, and he was able to suggest paths that would avoid both military patrols and known strongholds of hostile Apache bands. There are many of my people who would not understand what you are doing, Nalnish warned. They would see you as enemies and act accordingly. And there are many of my people who would see helping you as treason, Martha replied. I suppose we'll both be taking risks. When Samuel returned, he brought news that troubled Martha. Mrs. Crawford says there's been more Apache sign in the area lately, tracks near water sources, and Tom Henderson's place had some cattle go missing 2 nights ago. Martha noticed that Nalnish had tensed at this news. Do you know anything about this? She asked him directly. Perhaps, he said carefully. If Apache have been in this area, they might be scouting for my family as well, or they could be warriors looking for me. Warriors looking for you? Nalnish nodded grimly. I am not just any hunter, Martha Henderson. My grandfather was a chief, and my father leads one of the largest family groups in our band. My disappearance would be noticed, and others would have come searching. This revelation changed everything. If there were Apache warriors in the area looking for Nalnish, the Henderson family was potentially in great danger simply by having helped him. Why didn't you tell me this before? Martha asked. Because I hoped to slip away before they found any trace of me. I did not want to bring trouble to your family. Samuel, who had been listening with growing alarm, turned to his mother. Ma, we need to get him out of here right now. If there are Apache warriors nearby and they find out we've been sheltering him, they might think we're holding him prisoner. But even as they discussed their options, the sound of approaching horses could be heard in the distance. All 4 of them froze, listening intently. The hoofbeats were unshod, moving at a steady pace that suggested riders who knew exactly where they were going. They've found me, Nalnish said quietly. Martha's mind raced through their options. They could try to hide Nalnish, but if the Apache warriors were trackers of any skill, they would quickly find signs of his presence. They could try to flee, but they would never outrun Apache ponies. Or they could face whatever was coming with honesty and hope that Nalnish's presence would protect them rather than endanger them. How many? She asked. Nalnish listened carefully to the approaching hoofbeats. 5, maybe 6 horses. Will they be hostile? That depends on what they think has happened to me, and why I have been missing for so long. Martha made what she hoped would not prove to be the last decision of her life. Samuel, Emma, get behind me but stay calm. Nalnish, you need to go out and meet them. Explain what happened. Make sure they understand we helped you, not harmed you. Nalnish nodded and moved toward the door, but Martha caught his arm. "Will they believe you?" "I hope so," he said. "But Martha Henderson, if something goes wrong, if they think you have done something to harm me, you must not fight them. Promise me. Your only chance would be to surrender and hope that my word carries weight with them." Martha nodded, though the idea of surrendering her family's fate to a group of Apache warriors went against every instinct she had developed during her years on the frontier. The hoofbeats grew closer, and through the window, Martha could see dust clouds rising in the distance. Her heart pounded as she realized that in the next few minutes, she would discover whether her act of mercy had saved her family or doomed them. Nalnish walked out onto the porch, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. Martha, Samuel, and Emma watched from the doorway as 6 Apache warriors on horseback crested the small rise that overlooked their farm. The sight of the warriors was both magnificent and terrifying. They sat their horses with the easy grace of people born to the saddle, their long hair flowing in the desert breeze, their faces painted for war. Each carried weapons, rifles, bows, lances, and their eyes swept the homestead with the alertness of predators. The leader of the group, an older man with silver streaks in his black hair and scars that spoke of many battles, rode forward until he was close enough to speak to Nalnish without shouting. The conversation that followed was in Apache, rapid and intense, with much gesturing and pointing toward the house. Martha could not understand the words, but she could read the emotions: relief, anger, confusion, and something that might have been respect. The discussion went on for several minutes, with other warriors occasionally adding comments or questions. Finally, Nalnish turned back toward the house and called out in English. "Martha Henderson, the war leader Mangas would like to speak with you." Martha felt her legs go weak, but she forced herself to walk out onto the porch. Behind her, she could hear Samuel's sharp intake of breath and Emma's whispered prayer. The warrior called Mangas studied her with eyes that missed nothing. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but clear. "Woman, Nalnish tells me you found him dying and gave him food and medicine. He tells me you asked for nothing in return." "That's correct," Martha replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "Why would you do this thing? Apache and White Eyes are enemies." It was the same question Nalnish had asked, and Martha gave the same answer. "Because he needed help, and I couldn't stand by and watch someone suffer when I had the power to ease that suffering." Mangas translated her words for the other warriors, and Martha saw several of them exchange looks of surprise. The war leader turned back to her. "You know that some of your people have killed Apache who came in peace. You know that some of my people have killed white families who meant no harm. In this land, kindness is dangerous. It can get you killed." "Yes, I know that," Martha replied, "but I couldn't let fear stop me from doing what I believed was right." Again, Mangas translated, and this time Martha heard something that sounded like approval in the voices of some of the warriors. "Nalnish also tells me you offered to help him find his family," Mangas continued. "Yes. This too is dangerous for you. Why would you take such a risk for an Apache?" Martha looked at the faces of the 6 warriors, then at Nalnish, and finally at her own children standing behind her. When she spoke, her words came from the deepest part of her heart. "Because any father should be with his wife and child. Because families belong together. And because I believe that if we could see each other as people instead of enemies, maybe there could be peace in this land." The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch forever. Martha could hear her own heartbeat and the whisper of wind through the mesquite bushes. She waited for the war leader's response, knowing that her family's fate hung in the balance. When Mangas finally spoke, his words were not what she had expected. "Woman, you have done a great kindness to one of our people. Nalnish is the grandson of a great chief and the son of a respected leader. His loss would have been felt by many families." Martha nodded, not sure how to respond. "You offered to help him find his family. This will not be necessary. We know where they are and we will take him to them." Mangas paused, and Martha thought she detected the hint of a smile on his weathered face. "But your offer will not be forgotten." The war leader turned to address his men in Apache, and after a brief conversation, he looked back at Martha. "We have decided something, woman. You have shown honor to our people when you had no reason to do so. Therefore, we will show honor to yours." "I don't understand," Martha said. Nalnish stepped forward. "Martha Henderson, Mangas is saying that your family is under the protection of the Chiricahua Apache. As long as you remain on this land and conduct yourselves with honor, no Apache warrior will harm you or your property." Martha felt tears spring to her eyes as the full meaning of his words sank in. In a land where Apache raids were a constant threat, her family had just been granted something that no amount of money could buy: safety. I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say nothing," Mangas replied. "Just remember that enemies can choose to become something else if they have the courage to try." As the warriors prepared to leave, taking Nalnish with them, Martha felt a profound sense of loss. In the space of 2 days, this young Apache warrior had changed her understanding of what was possible in a land divided by fear and hatred. Nalnish approached the porch one last time. "I will not forget your kindness, Martha Henderson. Neither will my people. We will be watching over your family." "Will I ever see you again?" Martha asked. Nalnish smiled, and for the first time since she had found him, he looked truly happy. "When my son is old enough to understand stories, I will bring him here to meet the white woman who showed mercy to his father. I will teach him that not all people who look different from us are enemies." As the Apache warriors rode away, their horses' hooves raising dust clouds that gradually faded into the vast Arizona sky, Martha stood on her porch with her children and watched them disappear. She had no way of knowing that this was only the beginning of a relationship that would challenge everything both Apache and settler believed about each other. 3 months had passed since the Apache warriors had ridden away from the Henderson farm, taking Nalnish with them to reunite him with his family. Life had returned to its normal rhythm of daily chores, tending crops, and the constant vigilance that frontier life demanded. But Martha often found herself scanning the horizon, wondering about the young warrior she had helped and whether she would ever see him again. The promise of Apache protection had seemed almost too extraordinary to believe, but as the weeks passed, the evidence became undeniable. Other homesteads in the area reported missing livestock and signs of Apache presence, but the Henderson farm remained untouched. Their cattle grazed peacefully in the meadow by the creek, their chickens roosted safely each night, and no tracks appeared around their water sources except those of their own animals and the occasional deer or coyote. Samuel had initially been skeptical of the arrangement, convinced that the Apache promise of protection was either misunderstood or temporary. But as story after story reached them of raids on neighboring farms, while their own property remained secure, even he began to accept that something unprecedented was happening. "It doesn't make sense, Ma," he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "The Crawfords lost 10 head of cattle last week, and the Morrison place had their barn burned, but we haven't seen so much as a missing chicken." Martha rocked slowly in her chair, a piece of mending in her lap. "Maybe it makes perfect sense, son. Maybe this is what happens when people choose trust over fear." Emma, now 13 and growing tall like her mother, looked up from the book she was reading by the fading light. "Do you think Nalnish found his family?" "I hope so, sweetheart. I pray so." It was on a warm morning in early September that Martha got her answer. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when Rex began barking excitedly. But this was not his warning bark that signaled danger. This was the happy, welcoming bark he reserved for friends. Martha walked around to the front of the house and felt her heart leap with joy. Riding up the path to their homestead were 2 Apache warriors on horseback, and she immediately recognized one of them. Nalnish sat tall in the saddle, his face healthy and bright, looking nothing like the starving, wounded man she had found by her well 3 months earlier. But it was his companion that made Martha gasp in surprise and delight. Riding beside him was a young Apache woman holding a baby in her arms. This had to be Ayanna, Nalnish's wife, and their son. Samuel and Emma came running from the barn where they had been working, their faces showing the same mixture of excitement and amazement that Martha felt. The promised visit was actually happening. Nalnish dismounted and approached the porch with a smile that transformed his entire face. "Martha Henderson, I told you I would return when my son was old enough to hear stories." "And this must be Ayanna," Martha said, looking at the young woman who remained on her horse, watching the proceedings with intelligent, curious eyes. "Yes," Nalnish said, his voice filled with pride. "And this is my son Kai." He gestured to the baby in his wife's arms. "His name means willow tree in your language." Ayanna spoke softly to Nalnish in Apache, and he nodded before turning back to Martha. "My wife wants to know if she may dismount and meet the woman who saved her husband's life." Of course, Martha exclaimed. Please, both of you come sit on the porch. Emma, bring some water and something to eat. As Ayana dismounted with graceful ease despite holding her baby, Martha got her first close look at Nalnish's family. His wife was beautiful in a way that spoke of strength as well as gentleness. Her long black hair was braided with small ornaments that caught the sunlight, and she wore traditional Apache dress that was both practical and elegant. The baby in her arms was plump and healthy, with bright dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around him with lively interest. When Ayana stepped onto the porch, she and Martha stood looking at each other for a moment, two women from completely different worlds who shared the common bond of motherhood and love for family. Then Ayana did something that surprised everyone present. She stepped forward and, shifting the baby to one arm, embraced Martha warmly. When she stepped back, there were tears in her eyes. She spoke rapidly to Nalnish, who translated with visible emotion. She says that every day since I returned, she has thanked the Great Spirit for the white woman who showed mercy when she could have shown cruelty. She says that you gave her back her husband and her son his father, and that this is a debt that can never be repaid. Martha felt tears of her own as she looked at this young family, now reunited and whole. There is no debt, she said firmly. What I did because it was right, not because I expected anything in return. As they settled on the porch, Martha marveled at how natural it felt to be hosting this Apache family. Nalnish looked healthier than she had ever seen him, filled out from regular meals and clearly happy in a way that transformed his entire bearing. Ayana proved to be curious and intelligent, asking questions about the Henderson family and their life on the farm through Nalnish's translation. Little Kia was indeed old enough to be interested in the world around him. He watched everything with bright, alert eyes and reached for anything that came within his grasp. When Emma offered him her finger, he grabbed it and held on with surprising strength, making everyone laugh. He's strong, Samuel observed, and Martha could hear the admiration in her son's voice. Apache children must be strong, Nalnish replied. Life is not easy for our people, and weakness does not survive long in the desert. As the morning progressed, Martha learned about Nalnish's reunion with his family. The warriors had indeed taken him to the San Carlos reservation, where he had found Ayana and Kia living in conditions that were far from ideal, but managing to survive with the help of extended family. The reservation is not a good place, Nalnish said carefully, clearly not wanting to burden Martha with complaints but unable to completely hide his feelings. There is not enough food, and the agents do not always keep their promises. Many of our people are sick, and the children, he trailed off, shaking his head. But you're not there now, Martha observed. Nalnish and Ayana exchanged a look, and Martha sensed there was something important they wanted to tell her. No, Nalnish said finally. We are not there now. After I told Mangas and the other leaders about what happened here, about your kindness, they made a decision. They decided to try something that has never been tried before. What do you mean? They decided to see if it might be possible for Apache and white people to live near each other in peace, without reservations or soldiers or fear. Martha felt her breath catch. You mean? We mean that we have come to ask if you would be willing to let us build a small camp on your land, Martha Henderson. Not permanently, but as a place where Apache families could come to rest safely while traveling, where children could play without fear of soldiers, where perhaps Apache and white children could meet and learn that they do not have to be enemies. The magnitude of what Nalnish was suggesting hit Martha like a physical blow. He was talking about something that flew in the face of everything the territorial government stood for, something that could get them all killed if the wrong people found out about it. You're talking about creating a sanctuary, she said slowly. Yes, a place where both our peoples could learn to see each other as human beings instead of enemies. Martha looked at her children, seeing the excitement and fear warring in their faces. This was a decision that would affect all of them, potentially for the rest of their lives. What would this mean, practically speaking? She asked. Nalnish had clearly thought through the details. It would mean that small groups of Apache families would occasionally camp on your land for short periods, never more than a few families at a time, never for more than a few days. We would help with work on your farm in exchange for the safety you would provide. We would teach your children about the desert, about plants and animals and survival. Our children would learn about your ways of farming and building. And if the territorial government found out, they would probably try to stop it, Nalnish admitted. But your farm is isolated, and Apache are skilled at moving without being seen. The risk would be there, but it might be manageable. Martha found herself thinking about all the stories she had heard of Apache raids, of settlers killed and homesteads burned. But she also thought about the young man who had collapsed by her well, nearly dead from hunger and infection, who had shown nothing but gratitude and honor in response to her kindness. What do the other Apache leaders think about this idea? Some are skeptical, Nalnish replied honestly. They say that whites cannot be trusted, that this will end in betrayal and bloodshed. Others believe that it is worth trying, that maybe there is another way besides constant war. Yana spoke up, and Nalnish translated. My wife says that she has talked to other Apache women about you, about what you did. Many of them want to meet the white woman who showed such kindness to one of our men. Some have children who are sick and could benefit from your healing knowledge. Martha felt the weight of decision pressing down on her. This was not just about helping one person anymore. This was about potentially changing the relationship between two peoples who had been enemies for generations. She thought about her life back in Missouri, about the settled communities where everyone knew their neighbors and differences were resolved through talking rather than shooting. She thought about her children and the world she wanted them to inherit. If we did this, she said slowly, there would have to be rules, clear understandings about what was acceptable and what was not. Nalnish nodded eagerly. Of course, what would you require? No weapons brought onto the farm except for hunting tools. Any disputes to be settled by talking, not fighting. Children from both sides to be treated equally and with respect. And if anyone, Apache or white, breaks these rules, they would be asked to leave and not return. These are good rules, Nalnish agreed. I believe our leaders would accept them. Samuel, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. What about our neighbors, the other settlers? If they found out we were sheltering Apache families, even friendly ones, they might decide we were traitors. It was a valid concern, and Martha knew that Samuel was right to raise it. In the climate of fear that dominated the territory, their actions could easily be misunderstood. We would have to be very careful, she said, and we would have to be prepared for the possibility that some people would not understand what we were trying to do. Emma, who had been playing with baby Kai while the adults talked, looked up with the directness that only children possess. But isn't it better to try to make friends than to keep being afraid of each other forever? Out of the mouths of babes, Martha thought. Her daughter had summed up the entire situation in one simple question. Martha looked at Nalnish, at his wife holding their baby, at her own children, and made the decision that would define the rest of their lives. Yes, she said firmly, we'll try it. The joy that spread across Nalnish's face was like sunshine after a storm. Iana, understanding the decision from her husband's expression even before he translated, smiled through tears and reached out to squeeze Martha's hand. Over the following months, the Henderson farm became something unique in the Arizona territory, a place where Apache and settler families came together in peace. It started small, with just Nalnish's family and one or two others camping on Martha's land for a few days at a time. The Apache families proved to be model guests. They helped with farm work, shared their knowledge of desert plants and animals, and treated the Henderson family with respect and gratitude. In return, Martha provided medical care for their sick, taught some of the Apache women about preserving food and managing livestock, and allowed their children to play and learn alongside Samuel and Emma. The arrangement brought benefits that neither side had anticipated. The Apache knowledge of the desert proved invaluable during a particularly dry summer when their guidance helped Martha find new water sources for her crops. In return, Apache families gained access to medical care and agricultural knowledge that helped them survive the hardships of reservation life. Most importantly, the children from both sides began to form friendships that crossed all cultural boundaries. Emma became particularly close to a young Apache girl named Desba, and Samuel found himself learning hunting and tracking skills from Apache boys his own age. Word of the unusual arrangement began to spread, carefully and quietly, through both communities. Some Apache leaders remained skeptical, but others began to see the possibilities for a different kind of future. Among the settler community, reactions were mixed. Some viewed the Hendersons with suspicion and hostility, while others were intrigued by the idea that peaceful coexistence might be possible. The real test came almost a year after Nalnish's first visit, when a group of Apache raiders attacked a settlement 20 miles away, killing 2 men and stealing several horses. The territorial government immediately called for increased military patrols, and vigilante groups formed to hunt down any Apache they could find. Martha knew that her Apache friends were in grave danger. If they were discovered on her land now, they would likely be shot on sight regardless of their peaceful intentions. She made the difficult decision to send word through Nalnish that all Apache families should stay away from the farm until the crisis passed. But the Apache leaders had a different idea. Instead of fleeing, they sent a delegation to the Henderson farm with a proposal that took Martha's breath away. Mangas, the war leader who had first granted protection to Martha's family, arrived with several other prominent Apache leaders. Through Nalnish, they made an offer that was unprecedented in the history of Apache-settler relations. "They want to meet with the territorial governor and the military commanders," Nalnish translated. "They want to tell them about what has been happening here, about the possibility of peace between our peoples." Martha stared at him in amazement. "They want to use our farm as an example of what's possible." Yes, they believed that if government officials could see Apache and white families living together peacefully, it might change their minds about what is possible. It was an enormous risk for everyone involved. If the meeting went wrong, if the officials decided that the Henderson farm was a nest of traitors and collaborators, the consequences could be severe for all concerned. But Martha had come too far to turn back now. She had seen what was possible when people chose trust over fear, when they looked for common ground instead of reasons to fight. "Tell them yes," she said. "Tell them we'll do whatever we can to help." The meeting that took place 2 weeks later would become legendary in the history of the Arizona Territory. On neutral ground between the Henderson farm and Fort Bowie, Martha found herself serving as translator and mediator between Apache leaders and territorial officials who had never before sat down together as anything other than enemies. The conversation was tense and difficult, with years of mistrust and pain on both sides. But gradually, as the Apache leaders explained their vision of peaceful coexistence and Martha described what she had witnessed on her farm, something began to shift in the room. The territorial governor, a practical man named John Hoyt, listened carefully to everything that was said. When the formal presentations were finished, he asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. "What you're describing sounds ideal, but how do we know it can work on a larger scale? How do we know this isn't just an isolated exception?" Mangas, speaking through Nalnish, gave an answer that would be remembered for generations. "We know because we have tried it. We know because we have seen Apache children and white children playing together, learning from each other, growing up without fear. We know because we have seen that when people are treated with honor, they respond with honor." The outcome of that meeting was not immediate peace throughout the territory, but it was a beginning. A small reservation was established near the Henderson farm, with Martha serving as an unofficial liaison between the Apache families and the territorial government. The arrangement was not perfect, and there were still conflicts and misunderstandings, but it represented something that had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier: hope. Years later, when historians wrote about the pacification of the Apache and the settling of Arizona territory, they would often overlook the role played by one widow woman who chose mercy over fear. But among both Apache and settler families who lived through those times, the story of Martha Henderson and her act of kindness was told and retold, becoming a legend that reminded people of what was possible when enemies chose to see each other as human beings. Nalnish kept his promise to return regularly with his family. His son Kia grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally at home in Apache camps and on the Henderson farm. He would eventually become a leader among his people, advocating for peaceful coexistence and serving as a bridge between two worlds that had once seemed irreconcilably different. And Martha Henderson, the woman who had sheltered a starving Apache warrior, lived to see her grandchildren playing with Apache children in the desert, learning the old ways alongside the new, growing up in a world where the color of a person's skin did not automatically make them an enemy. The farm that had once stood alone and vulnerable in the vast Arizona desert became a symbol of something that many had thought impossible, proof that in a land torn by hatred and fear, love and understanding could still take root and flourish. It was a legacy that would endure long after the last Apache war chief had laid down his weapons, and the last territorial governor had signed the papers making Arizona a state. In the end, Martha's simple act of giving water to a thirsty man and food to someone who was hungry had changed the course of history in ways she could never have imagined. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful force for change in the world is not violence or politics or grand gestures, but simple human kindness extended from one person to another across the barriers that divide us.